You had a story this week that those police interactions would increase with Black San Diegans because according to the latest census numbers, 6% of the city's population is Black, but Black San Diegans make up 27% of the unsheltered population. That's according to the latest annual homeless census count. So Lisa, your story lays out kind of a possibility that city council members and advocates are worried about. What are they saying?
Well, I think to just take a step back, I mean, what we're talking about is that there's, if you're a Black San Diegan, you are disproportionately likely to be homeless, and you're also disproportionately likely to be affected by enforcement. Mm-hmm. And so I had done an analysis of encroachment enforcement. Now, encroachment is basically blocking a sidewalk. It's the primary tool that the police now use to address homelessness. And what I found is that from 2018 through last month, or actually through May, mm-hmm. I can't believe we're already in July, that 28% of the citations and arrests were given to Black people. And I think that's really significant and speaks to the concerns that some folks have both in the advocate community and on the city council. Mm-hmm. There's a concern that we already know that Black San Diegans are disproportionately likely to be homeless and to be affected by enforcement. And so if you have a new enforcement tool, it's likely that they are going to be disproportionately impacted by that as well. And the encroachment numbers do bear that out. Mm-hmm. They're concerned too about, what are the impacts of these encounters, right? So how might, that encounter, might mean that somebody has a harder time getting off the street, or maybe that they're less likely to accept services. And so there was quite a tense discussion at city council when they voted on the camping ban because of the concerns surrounding this.
Right. And you had someone in your story who felt, there's the argument of like bias here with police officers, and you had someone in your story who personally experienced something that, led to them being disconnected with the, resource that he was connecting with to, eventually move off the street.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about Anthony.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, Anthony's number has changed, so I wasn't able to get in touch with him. This is really common for folks who live on the street. It can be hard to stay in touch. But I was talking to Anthony quite a bit last year after an encounter that he had at Balboa Park that just really traumatized him. He ended up just fleeing that area because he was so concerned about running into the police again and potentially being arrested. And as you pointed out, he ended up losing contact with the service provider that was coming to that area of Balboa Park to try to help him. Mm-hmm. And he actually lost contact with them for weeks. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly, he popped up again. One thing that I didn't mention in the story is he said to me, and this just always sticks with me since this conversation, is he said, sometimes I just have to remind myself that I'm a person. Mm-hmm. And I think that just really speaks to the fact that he felt like he was being treated as a pest. Mm-hmm. And, certainly, felt that perhaps his race was part of the story there.
Yeah. What do the police say in response to concerns from advocates that, this will affect Black San Diegans disproportionately in the topic of bias?
So they say that this isn't a bias issue. Mm-hmm. They point out that, the unsheltered population, 27% of it is Black San Diegans, and that their citations, the 28% that I cited earlier, kind of line up. And mm-hmm. so that speaks to, not a disproportionate impact when you look at the homeless population specifically. But they do say if there are concerns that people have about bias, they want to hear about them, and that they are trying to, make sure officers receive training. So every 2 years they're receiving anti-bias training, and that this is something they're talking about on a regular basis. But certainly I think, what can't be missed is that, whether the police might argue that there's not a bias issue, there are a lot of people that feel that there's a bias issue. Mm-hmm. And, had a conversation with the police captain I quoted in the story, and we were just talking about how, sometimes what happens in one of these encounters, it can be really hard to prove, mm-hmm. but that doesn't mean that the person didn't feel something. And certainly I've talked to a lot of people over the years who have felt that their race played a role in how they were treated in an encounter with a police officer.
So obviously the city council had a pretty, tense moment in that meeting. What was the result of the conversation that they were having about race and enforcement and what they were hoping to change?
So Council President Sean Elo Rivera wanted to add an amendment to the ordinance to track all stops related to this encampment ban. And the police came back and said, well, we can't really do that. And Councilmember Stephen Whitburn requested a break so that they could sort of talk about this. And when they came back from the break, there was a really tense exchange with Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp, who was concerned, like, are you guys trying to just like not track this? Like, what's going on? And there was further conversation about it. The police said, well, we can't actually track stops. I won't get into the weeds on why that is, but they said they couldn't actually track stops, but they could provide monthly reports tracking actual enforcement and provide a breakdown of the races of folks that received tickets.
This is citations.
Or arrests, yes. And so they will, going forward, the city council approved that amendment to provide monthly reports tracking enforcement and providing racial data. And so Council President Elo Rivera said to me, that it's his hope that by at least tracking this and being aware of it, police and the city will do all that they can to avoid this disproportionate impact that they're very concerned about.
You can read that story at vosd.org/Lisa. So another thing that came up during this morning press conference on Thursday was the mayor talked about a story that our Will Huntsberry had this week about a wealthy family and their company and how they're blocking a new housing project.
Yes. He weighed in on it. I heard he gave it a lot of clarity.
He made sure we had credit.
Well, I appreciate that.
So, Will, tell us, what did you find?
Well, like you said, I'll back up even further than what you said. The city has been trying to buy extended stay motels around town for quite some time with state money called home key money. And they're trying to buy these extended stay motels to permanently house homeless people. And I heard that they had their eyes on one and it was getting blocked. And it was getting blocked by this 100-year-old San Diego company, maybe the oldest San Diego company still in existence, a powerhouse of Southern California development, H.G. Fenton. I had heard that they were blocking this deal, and long story short, I found out that was true.
So who is H.G. Fenton?
So H.G. Fenton, the company started in 1906. It was started by this man named Henry G. Fenton. Like I said, they're big in development now, and they have lots of developments across Southern California. But in 1906, Henry G. Fenton he started as a ranch hand in the San Pasqual Valley when he was 7 years old.
Nice.
Moved here with his mom.
A little bit of history here.
Yeah. Quick little history lesson. And he ended up basically getting some contracts for public improvements. Like he paved a lot of the streets in Coronado. He built this jetty that extends off Coronado. He worked on the Tijuana racetrack. So he was involved in all these early infrastructure projects across the city. And he also started buying up huge chunks of land, ranches and quarries. I told you he used to be a ranch hand. He was into that whole ranch thing. And so he died around 1950-ish. And after that, the H.G. Fenton Company began developing all this land he had bought. And, they kept those quarries running for a while and those ranches. But eventually they put all that away and they said, we're only going to do real estate and development. And one of the key places they wanted to develop, they called Mission Valley Heights. It's in Mission Valley, just north of the 8, and it's where this extended stay motel is. So they had all these plots of land there, and they started something called a covenant, which our listeners may or may
creepy.
not be. Not a coven,
Not a coven.
not a coven. No, a covenant. And so covenants are kind of like homeowners association rules. Basically, anybody who bought a plot of land in Mission Valley Heights from H.G. Fenton had to sign on to this covenant, and it had all these restrictions in it, including that there could be no subsidized housing. So, that means the home key program. That means the government housing people. So they sold a chunk of land. Extended Stay America bought it, but Extended Stay America had to sign on to the covenant. Extended Stay America decides they're down to sell to the city. The city decides they want to buy it. This place has 140 rooms, so you're talking it could house a couple hundred people at least, in those rooms. So when the city goes to make the purchase, they find out about this covenant, and it needless to say, throws a wrench in the whole thing. The city asked H.G. Fenton to change the covenant. They had the power to do that, but H.G. Fenton was like, "Nah, dog, we're not doing it. We're not changing it. Not a chance."
Is a covenant that denies the ability to create affordable housing on a plot of land, is that even legal? I feel like that would be something that at this point, as we're trying to develop everything because of our crazy housing shortage, that just would not be allowed.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And other people ask me that too. Like, how can you block something from happening on a piece of land that's not yours?
Yeah.
Because the zoning doesn't preclude that, right? Anybody who wants to build something, they have to stick in with the city's zoning laws. The projects have to conform to that. But this was just like a private contract between different parties who own, a big chunk of land together. And long story short, it's questionable whether you can do that. Some people say you can do that. Some people say you can't do that. The state of California actually specifically wrote a law 2 years ago that said people could get these covenants struck down. So the city could have tested that. The city did have a legal tool at their disposal to try to overturn this covenant. But, the home key funds do have a tight deadline to get them, and it's just weeks away. And so basically the city's response to me was, we think this law is questionable, number one. We're not even sure it holds up in court. And number two, it's just going to be too much of a logistical challenge for us to try to fight this.
So at the press conference on Thursday morning, I asked the mayor about this, and, his response was basically, we'll seek every opportunity we have to try to get affordable housing, but this deadline is just a problem, and we need to meet this deadline. He threw in a little bit of a jab about some previous reporting that Jacob and I did about the city in the past missing an initial deadline, city and county, all the cities actually in the county, missing an initial deadline at an easy crack at some money. And he said that, we want to meet the deadline this time. We want to get the money. I did note to him that, he could take this to court. He didn't seem too excited about that.
I think it's very fair on the city's part to point out that there were very difficult timeline problems at stake here. But I think, we would also be remiss to not point out how powerful H.G. Fenton is.
Well, that part where he said we did not receive a favorable response. I think the quote in your story captured how powerful and how unfavorable that response was. You want to read it? It's pretty good.
Sure. Yeah, so the mayor said it a little diplomatically there. Walter Spaeth, an attorney for the San Diego Housing Commission, said the response was absolutely not, and we're going to do whatever we can to stop it. They have deep pockets, and we have every reason to believe they were not bluffing. So that's basically what H.G. Fenton said to the suggestion that they changed their covenant.
So H.G. Fenton, we're talking like Fenton Parkway.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking I don't know if we'd call him a founding father of San Diego, but certainly a power player in its early development. And, for that matter, the company's still very powerful today. They spend a lot of time lobbying City Hall. They have been involved in the building association here and running it for many years. Not only that, they've spent a lot of time raising money for Todd Gloria. They've donated a lot of money to Todd Gloria. So these are people who are talking to him and his staff members all the time. They're raising money for him, and they are very opinionated when it comes to development, and their opinion in this case won out, and that was perhaps aided by the timeline at play.
Is it true that there already are homeless folks staying in this extended stay hotel?
Well, yes, it is. that was a deep irony of reporting this story, is that there are actually homeless people staying there now, and various programs have been funding homeless people to stay in this extended motel as far back as COVID. And so Spaeth, the Housing Commission attorney, he told me that is something that would have played in the city's favor, right? That because something that matters in court is not just that you have a contract on paper, but how you enforce that contract on a day-to-day basis. And if you've never been enforcing the contract, you have a much weaker argument that your contract is really at play.
So what happens now?
Did he shed any light on that whatsoever, Lisa? I think Lisa kind of tried to ask him what happens now today.
Well, it's unclear, what the future prospects for this hotel purchase are. He said that they're very focused on, finishing the due diligence for the other 2 hotels that they're still looking at. And they already submitted a home key application for 2 other sites. So they're now pretty focused on moving forward with the others.
But they've had multiple motels in the works throughout. But it's definitely worth noting that even if they get these 2, they've been shifting motels in and out as it goes along, as they try to figure out which motels will work for them. But, the maximum beds they're going to get has certainly now been decreased. Not exactly by 140, but close to 100. Even if they get everything they want at this point, Fenton will have, certainly had its way in making sure that there are going to be less permanent housing units available in the future. And you can feel about that however you want to. Maybe you think that's great. Some people are very anti-housing first these days, right? Or you can think it's a tragedy that this corporation had this influence. The fact of the matter is they had it. There will be less beds. And, it's important to keep track of.
Well, let's connect this back to our earlier discussion about the safe campsite. And, certainly the mayor has talked about adding additional shelter. If you don't have places for people to go from these safe campsites or the shelters or the safe campsites become permanent destinations, which they were never intended to be. And so earlier this year, I had reported on the fact that at that time, just 11% of people who were exiting shelters were moving into permanent housing. And there were people that were waiting a really long time in shelters for housing. And at the time, the Housing Commission told me that they were essentially in a resource desert. They didn't have housing options for folks to the degree that they needed them. And this home key application was really seen as a great opportunity. And so now there's just going to be a bit fewer. At least we know for sure, because they have to apply to get the money and move forward with the purchases. But we know that there are going to be fewer resources than they hoped there would be. Thankfully, I'm happy to report the shelter outcomes have gotten a little bit better recently. About 15% of people exiting shelters in more recent history have been moving into homes. But I think anybody who looks on our streets right now can see that we need a lot more places for people to be.